Okay, the video has started, so whenever they're ready there too.
We'll go live right when it's 16. Stand by.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Yountville Town Council meeting for Tuesday, November 16th, 2021. I am masked up today because I am joined by our Vice Mayor, Terry Dorman, and we are following proper indoor mask protocols for this meeting. And my glasses are fogging up, so I'll try to read this teleconferencing script cleanly before we get to our agenda. This regular meeting of the Town Council is being held pursuant to Government Code Section 54953E related to teleconferencing of meetings. The Governor's proclamation of a state emergency is still in effect, and the Town Council has made or will make the necessary findings under the law to hold teleconference meetings in this manner. Proper notice was given for this meeting. All persons are permitted to join remotely and address the Town Council directly. And the meeting will be delayed in the event of a town-caused disruption. This meeting will be held in all respects according to the requirements of Government Code Section 54953E. The town manager is present in his office. I am present in the council chambers along with Vice Mayor Dorman, and council members Moeller, Dornbecker, and Knight, along with staff, are participating remotely by video, audio, in conformance with Government Code Section 54953E. I will now ask our Deputy Town Clerk, Eddie Gomez, to conduct roll and ask each member of the council to confirm that they can hear the proceedings and have a copy of the meeting agenda. Eddie.
Councilmember Knight.
Here and yes to both.
Councilmember Dornbecker.
Yes to both.
Councilmember Moeller.
Yes to both.
Vice Mayor Dorman.
Here and yes to both.
Mayor Dunbar.
Yes, here. We have confirmed that all the council is present and has the agenda. I will move one more note, actually. Public comment can be done a couple different ways. One, as a Zoom webinar attendee and using the Zoom raise hand feature. And I will call on anyone that is participating in that format. Also, public comment is available by email to publiccomment@wyville.com. I know that we do have one general public comment that was received prior to this meeting. Also via the e-comment feature in Prime Gov, which can be found as a speech bubble with the HTML agenda. And I will remind viewers that any vote taken during the teleconference portion of the meeting will be taken by a verbal roll call vote led by the Deputy Town Clerk. Okay, so let's go ahead and proceed. I will invite our Vice Mayor, Terry Dorman, to lead us to the Pledge of Allegiance.
Thank you, Mayor. Would all please stand as you're able.
Thank you very much. Next is the adoption of today's agenda. I don't believe we have any changes, so if there's a motion to adopt.
Move adoption.
Second.
Motion by Councilmember Knight, second Councilmember Dornbecker. Voice vote, Eddie?
Yes, Councilmember Knight.
Yes.
Councilmember Dornbecker.
Yes.
Councilmember Moeller.
Yes.
Vice Mayor Dorman.
Yes.
Mayor Dunbar.
Yes. Thank you. We have no proclamations or recognitions today, so we'll go on to our general public comment. And I believe we do have one from Billy Hewitt. Eddie, if you could read that and any others that have been submitted.
Yes, Mayor, that is the only one we have received so far. And it says, "Dear Honorable Mayor Dunbar and council members, I express my seasonal gratitude to all of you for serving the community during trying times. Last Saturday, I went to the invigorating and fun event of the Blue Zone Upper Napa Valley Kickoff in St. Helena, encouraging people to live longer, better. Town officials from Calistoga and St. Helena were present and spoke of their endorsement and buy-in of the project. When does Youngville stand on the project? Or where does Youngville stand on the project? The concept seems natural for Youngville. I'll take my answer off the air since I cannot tune in to the meeting today. 3 of us signed commitments to volunteer if and when Youngville joins the project. Billy Hewitt.
Thank you. And so staff can follow up with Ms. Hewitt about that item. We'll move on to our consent calendar. We have 3 items, 7A, B, and C. If there's no discussion or interest to pull, is there a motion to accept the consent calendar as presented?
Mueller
moved.
moves approval of the consent calendar.
I heard 2 voices. I
Second.
think I'll take a motion by Councilmember Mueller, second Councilmember Dornbecker. Voice vote, please, Eddie.
Yes. Councilmember Mueller,
Yes.
Councilmember Dornbecker,
Yes.
Councilmember Knight,
Yes.
Vice Mayor Dorman,
Yes.
Mayor Dunbar.
Yes. That passes unanimously. Thank you very much. Now we have a presentation, the CAL FIRE Public Safety Quarterly Report. So I believe, do we have the battalion chief here? I think we do.
Yes, I'm on. Can you hear me?
Yes, welcome.
All right. Well, thank you for inviting me. This will be the first report that I've gone through, and it sounds like you guys have the kind of the PowerPoint and what we've sent for the quarterly report from July, August, and September, correct?
Correct. It's going on.
Okay. So with everything that's on there, the statistical analysis out of all the calls that for the quarter is 368, and it breaks down which calls were medical aid, public assist, and things like that. As you can see, for the town of Yountville, there was 79 calls. The Veterans Home, 145, and then in the surrounding county areas, we went to 139 calls and assisted Napa City with 5 of those calls. And then this section here shows what it was for last year. Pretty much kind of the same numbers. There's a little more medical aids last year, but our 5-year average, we're actually a little bit below that for the medicals and everything on the 5-year average. As you guys know, throughout the summer, there was large fires everywhere else. And we got very lucky here in the valley for everything. We didn't have any major fires in Napa Valley like we had, or in the unit like we had last year. Right here, for the town itself, you can see the majority of the calls that we have run have been medical aids in the town, with very few other calls. Probably the next one up will be the public assist and alarm soundings that we've responded to in the town of Yountville. And next slide, please. So Veterans Home, aside from any of the, I know they went to an alarm sounding, it was probably about a month ago, it came in as, I believe, a structure fire. I was off duty, but it ended up being their boiler room and a bunch of steam coming out. It had flooded, and they were there for a little bit, getting all the water pumped out and all that. Majority of the calls, again, at the Vets Home have been medical aids, and then a few of the alarm soundings. So this is their technical rescue team, or TRT team. This is one of the drills we had with more rope rescue and high angle rescue. And this shows how stretching rope across, this is out at the training ground, stretching rope across the creek and anchoring it to an engine on one side and the trees on the other side. How we can string somebody across, lower them down, pick a victim on the rocks. You see the firefighter sitting there on the rocks as a victim. They can lower down, pick them up, bring them back up, and bring them to either side, whether we go over to the far side or back to where the engines are. Next slide, please. So this is some more training with the stations and everything, some of the specialty tools. The photo on the right is specialty tools that they carry on the rescue for cutting concrete. And then photo on the left is some more training with high angle type rope rescue stuff and how you would come out come down and switch from rappelling to climbing again. And then I believe the next slide is the, movie night in the park. So I know I believe the engine went there for this. I was, during this time, I think I was gone most of the time on some of the other fires that we had in the state. But I know the guys are very excited about going and participating in any of the community events that go on. Do you guys have, I believe this is it for the PowerPoint presentation. Is there any questions from anybody, or is there something that I didn't cover? Because this is my first one doing.
No, you're a natural, Battalion Chief. No problem. I don't see any hands raised by the council. Thank you. And what I'll just remind folks is that we are very fortunate to have this kind of expertise and training available to us. Station 12 in particular being part of our Yountville community, but valley-wide and county-wide, to have this kind of emergency response support and training is really exceptional. So thank you, and please pass on our appreciation to the entire team.
Will do. And is there anything else you guys need from me?
Just keep us safe.
All right, we'll do our best. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Okay. Thank you for the Public Safety Quarterly Report from CAL FIRE. We don't have any public hearings today, and so we're going to move on to our first administrative item, item 10A, Municipal Code Update, introduction and waiving of the first reading of ordinance number 21-504, amending sections 8.05.120 and 8.05.130 of chapter 8.05 of Title 8 of the Yountville Municipal Code regarding administrative fines and penalties.
Yes, thank you, Mayor and council members. So before you tonight or this afternoon is a straightforward ordinance that amends one section of your administrative enforcement provisions of the municipal code. These are the sections that staff uses to enforce in-house code violations of the Yountville Municipal Code or conditions placed on permits and approvals and use permits and things of the like. The amount of fines and penalties that the town can impose are set by state law. Changes the amounts in the municipal code to reflect recent changes in state law. And that is all that the ordinance in front of you does. All the other provisions and procedures related to administrative enforcement are unchanged. Only the amounts are increased per what's in the ordinance. I'm happy to answer any questions about background or the state law changes.
Thank you, Gary. The first of several Gary reports today. Councilmember Knight, question?
Thank you, Attorney Bell. Just a quick question. Looking at the resolution, I appreciate that you said this is straightforward, but on Section E, it talks about any code violation may be subject to an administrative penalty not exceeding $1,000. But in just the general discussion between like A, B, and C on the resolution, there's other dollar limits. And so I'm I have a question about why item E in the resolution says shall not exceed, while some of the other bullet points talk about other numbers that exceed that amount. Thank you.
Yeah, so the municipal code, and this is common with both city and county municipal codes regarding administrative enforcement, makes a distinction between fines and penalties. And that's because state law makes a distinction between fines and penalties. So state law sets limits for the fines that may be imposed, and those are what's included in subdivision A and B and C, I believe. And section E or subdivision E relates to penalties, which still may not exceed $1,000, which is why that limit remains unchanged. That's a current provision in the municipal code. It's not being modified by this ordinance. It's just restated because it's part of the same section that's being amended.
Thank you. Just quick then a follow-up. So in the practical application of this, how would a penalty be, how would a person be subject to a penalty versus the fine? That's just an additional fee for administrative work on the to respond to a fine.
Well, the way that state law makes the distinction is any violation of the municipal code that could be prosecuted as a misdemeanor may be subject to a penalty. And any other violation of the municipal code, which might be charged as an infraction, can be subject to a fine. And I can give you more background on that if you'd like, but that's the
Right.
So there are two
I'll
different.
follow up with you at a future time. Thank you very much.
There are two different violations, is what you're saying, Gary, correct?
Correct.
Different levels of violation and infraction versus what was the term you used? Violation?
Misdemeanor.
Misdemeanor, yeah. Okay, thank you. I don't see any other hands raised for questions. Eddie, do we have any public comment on this item?
We do not have any comment here.
Okay, thank you. Then I'll consider a motion to introduce and waive the first reading of this ordinance.
I will make a motion that we introduce ordinance number and waive the reading for ordinance number 21-504, an ordinance of the Town Council of the Town of Yountville, amending sections 8.05.120 and 8.05.130 of Chapter 8.05 of Title 8 of the Yountville Municipal Code reading administrative fines and penalties.
Second.
Okay, motion, Councilmember Dornbecker, second, Councilmember Knight. Eddie, a voice roll call vote, please.
Councilmember Dornbecker,
Yes.
Councilmember Knight,
Yes.
Councilmember Mueller,
Yes.
Vice Mayor Dorman,
Yes.
Mayor Dunbar.
Yes. Thank you. Next up, item 10B, contract proposal. Consider adoption of resolution 21-4088, approving contract with California Consulting for purposes of grant writing and management support in an amount not to exceed $25,200 for the remainder of fiscal year 21-22, and to allocate $25,200 from the annual assigned for budget contingencies fund to fund the contract. Steve, this is you. Cannot hear you, Steve. Must be a local mute button because you were not muted in Zoom. Nope.
He has
Still
to
no audio.
probably,
So maybe if you can log out and log back in, Steve, that might be necessary, and we can just pause for a minute while you come back.
I believe it might be a setting.
If is returning, sometimes that does seem to allow for the audio and video connection. If not, then we'll move on. No, the vice mayor wants to try to turn off my audio. You couldn't read her lips, but I could feel it behind her mask. Yeah, so we'll just wait another moment. See if we can get our town manager back. So let's do this. Let's go ahead and move on to our next item. And that is item 10C. Would not anticipate this being a long item, so we'll get Steve back in just a moment. Item 10C, hold on just one second. I'm checking this message. Okay. Item 10C, Municipal Code Update and Implementation. Second reading and consider adoption of ordinance number 21-503, adding Division 8, Chapter 13.160 to Title 13 of the Yountville Municipal Code regarding mandatory organic waste disposal and related requirements under SB 1383 and SB 1383 regulations. Consideration of, and approval of a memorandum of understanding between the town of Yountville and the Upper Valley Waste Management Agency regarding implementation of SB 1383 and authorize the town manager to execute it on behalf of the town. And so we can go ahead and have Gary make that report while we still wait for our town manager. Gary?
Yeah, happy to, Mayor and council members. I'd also request that these be taken as separate items when the council considers them, the ordinance and then the MOU. So before you tonight is the second reading of the ordinance that was discussed at the last meeting. There's been no changes, and so I won't go into detail with that ordinance unless some member of the council would like to discuss it in more detail. The substance before you this afternoon is the MOU with the Upper Valley Waste Management Agency. And you might recall earlier this spring of this year, a Fifth Amendment to the JPA agreement, which operates and governs the agency's operations, was adopted by the town and the other members of the JPA to authorize the agency to implement SB 1383, among other waste and recent changes in state law. The ordinance that was already for first reading and now back for second reading authorizes a delegation of responsibilities and oversight to the agency as the regional agency in a JPA. So this MOU is really the last piece of that. This is the agreement that actually delegates that authority to the agency for reporting, data collection, other aspects of oversight and implementation of 1383, and authorizes them, the agency, to transfer it over to the franchisee through the franchise agreement. So that's basically an overview of the MOU, and I'm happy to go into particular details of it. Each of the members is adopting an identical MOU that's before you this evening, either at meetings that happened earlier this week or shortly after.
And as I recall, it is that very reason that we're not looking at actually changing any wording language, because it's important that everyone is adopting the exact same content.
Right.
Right. Okay. Councilmember Moeller, we offered you the opportunity last time to add anything additional to the staff report if you feel it's appropriate. Otherwise, we can just proceed.
No, I think it is the second reading. We had some discussion last time, so I'm ready to proceed, Mayor.
Okay, let me just check. I don't see any other hands raised. Let me just see if we have any public comment that's come in. Eddie?
We have not received any public comment, Mayor.
Okay, thank you. And I see that we've added a couple of attendees. I don't know if one of those attendees might be our town manager trying to be let in. So Eddie or Michelle or Samantha could maybe see if that's what's happening there. Okay, so there's no further discussion on the ordinance. We will take it as Gary requested, the second reading and adoption of the ordinance. If there is a motion to that effect, I will entertain that right now.
I will make that motion if you'd like. I'd like to make the motion that we approve ordinance number 21-503, an ordinance of the Town Council of the Town of Yountville, adding Division 8, Chapter 13.160 to Title 13 of the Yountville Municipal Code regarding mandatory organic waste disposal and related requirements under SB 1383 and SB 1383 regulations, and waive the reading.
A second.
Thank you. A motion by Councilmember Moeller, second Councilmember Knight. Eddie, if you could do an audio voice vote, please.
Councilmember Moeller,
Yes.
Councilmember Knight,
Yes.
Councilmember Dornbecker,
Yes.
Vice Mayor Dorman,
Yes.
Mayor Dunbar.
Yes. So that part one passes. Also, anyone that's in the attendee window, if your name comes up as test email, would you please enter your full name so we can identify you, because it's defaulting to test email. So if you could please find the rename option and put your name in there, that would be appreciated. Thank you. Because we think one of those might be our town manager. So part 2 of this would be considering approval of the memorandum of understanding. Councilmember Mueller, did you want to proceed with the motion on that item?
Yes, I would like to do that. Thank you. I would like to make a motion that we approve the memorandum of understanding between the town of Yountville and the Upper Valley Waste Management Agency regarding implementation of SB 1383.
I'll second.
Thank you. There is a motion by Councilmember Mueller, second by Councilmember Dornbecker. Vice Mayor, you have a hand raised.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. And thank you for the report, Mr. Bell. I just have sort of a general question on the complaint and enforcement procedures. So it looks like it goes from the hauler to the JPA to the town, and the town is the only one with enforcement ability. Is it correct so far?
That is correct. And code enforcement must stay with the town. And so ultimately the town decides what level of enforcement and how is necessary under the circumstances. Yes.
And is it this document, or will there be additional documentation that talks about how the agency will investigate, or how the hauler will investigate an alleged complaint, or if they find something when they flip the lids? I'm just interested in the actual process of it.
So there will be an amendment to the franchise agreement between the agency and UVDS that discusses their information collection and reporting. And that data and reporting, which will probably include some monthly and quarterly reports that are sent, will include information like who doesn't have service, for example, or contamination and things like that. That will be included in the reporting and the data that's given to the agency as part of what the agency then reports to CalRecycle. But part of that information will necessarily include information that's relevant to potential violations. Then the first step is for the agency to be proactive in that regard. And then if unsuccessful, to pass it to the town for the town's decision on that matter.
And who at the town makes the decision on the matter?
That's under the section that the other ordinance just amended. And so that would be the code enforcement officer on that subject matter, which would be a town employee.
Okay, so ultimately the decision, because I know it says that agencies will educate hauler educates generator, et cetera, et cetera. So ultimately it remains with the town to decide whether the scope of that education has been sufficient and whether there actually should be an enforcement proceeding.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
One other item that has come up in this conversation is when residential or even commercial waste is still under the responsibility of the property owner, and when it changes hands. And I know there's a concern about if somebody were to put inappropriate debris into a bin or a dumpster, and then the owner of that bin or dumpster is held accountable for it. I think that's where the investigation comes in, and there needs to be some level of evidence that has shown that any violation or responsibility goes to the proper party. And Gary, I don't know that there's any language that can really manage that at this point. It's going to be part of the challenge of the enforcement, correct?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, I had a really long question. You had a really short answer.
Well, to get more detail, anytime the town undertakes code enforcement, there needs to be substantial evidence supporting it. And part of the back and forth between the agency and generators and the hauler will be putting things in place to address things like this. So if the initial investigation were to find, as you suggested, that had happened, there could be something in place like some kind of locking mechanism that only the owner could have to open it, for example, to use it. And then that would solve that for future or something similar. And so all those steps would be taken and the investigation would be complete long before enforcement action would be taken.
Great, thank you. Councilmember Knight, question?
Thank you, Mayor. Question for town attorney. So you mentioned that the town retains the responsibility as code enforcer. Would the fines or penalties that might be subject to code enforcement, is that related to the municipal code update fines and penalties that we just approved today?
Yes.
So those fee numbers in terms of for health and safety code violations is what would be relevant to a code enforcement of this issue?
Well, there were three different possible fines under that section. One's for building and safety code violations, which wouldn't seem to apply in this case, or likely wouldn't apply in this case. That's more of a building code type violation. The second is for short-term rentals, which wouldn't apply in this case, and the other is a general fine. But the penalty amount that we discussed would apply as well. So that section and the fines and the penalties that are in there, to the extent they apply to the violation, are the ones that the town would be imposing.
Good, thank you.
Councilmember Mueller?
I just wanted to take a minute to remind everyone that these are really the instruments that we need to put in place based on state law, SB 1383. We mandatory fines will not go in place until 2024. There will be lots and lots of education, just like we've had lots of education for the last 2 years that this is coming. We'll be sending out consistent messages through, all the member agencies. So I know you've heard me say this, I'm probably like a broken record. You're going to be hearing a lot about it because that's important to us to really make sure that everybody understands which part is going in place. Right now, we're getting everybody used to putting their food scraps in their little bucket and putting those in the green can. And we've talked about the brown can is going to change out to gray over time. So this is a message that we're working with very closely, not only on the Upper Valley Waste Management, but you'll be hearing a lot more from the town over time too. So it's not just one time that you're hearing this and you have to remember it. We promise we'll give you plenty of education and plenty of time to get used to this new law.
I think that was it from the staff presentation. If there were any more questions, I think there's a first and second on the floor.
Yes, and I just was talking to myself in my mask because I was muted. But I was going to add on to Councilmember Mueller. The town does need to show, and the associated parties need to show a good faith effort to avoid penalties until that delayed date. So we do need to change the behavior and show that new behavior is compliant as much as possible. Thankfully, there was a follow-up bill that allowed a delay in penalties for any violation. So there is that learning curve that's there as long as we are making a good faith effort. So Councilmember Knight, we do have a motion and a second on the floor, but if there's further discussion, Councilmember Knight.
I just wanted to thank Councilmember Mueller and your comments for clarifying the fines and penalties and the time allowed for people to be in compliance. So thank you.
Thank you. So let's go ahead, Eddie, and take a voice roll call vote, please.
Sure. Councilmember Mueller,
Yes.
Councilmember Dornbecker,
Yes.
Councilmember Knight,
Yes.
Vice Mayor Dorman,
Yes.
Mayor Dunbar.
Yes. So those both pass. We're going to move back now that we have our town manager back to item 10B. And for the record, I'll repeat, this item is a contract proposal to consider adoption of resolution 21-4088 approving contract with California Consulting for purposes of grant writing and management support in an amount not to exceed $25,200 for the remainder of fiscal year 21-22, and to allocate $25,200 from the annual assigned for budget contingencies fund to fund the contract. Steve, let's see if we can hear you.
It is good, hopefully, to not be silent. So hopefully we're good to go. And again, a test to technology in 2021. I briefly want to share that, I'm very proud of the town staff and our accomplishment in receiving a number of grants. Recently, the town has been successful with a park and recreation grant for a restroom replacement project. We've been successful with a Caltrans grant that expanded the Hopper Creek path, along with a Cal OES grant for electrical generation connection to fully allow for the full complete community center to be able to be on a diesel generator backup for power, as well as 2 local planning grants. Now, while we're excited about the ones that we've been successful, the town has also not been successful on a number of grants, and in some cases has had to make the decision not to move forward with a potential grant because of either the potential complexity or just a lack of time and prioritization. So one of the things that we're looking at and we're proposing is a consultant agreement with California Consulting for grant writing support. What I want to be really clear is that this is really a partnership approach. If approved, the staff of California Consulting, and I will point out that they're multifaceted. So what they do is they have experts assigned to a number of ranges. How they approach us would be an orientation meeting where staff in those technical areas would work with us. They'd interview us. They'd get our background facts. The other thing we'll point out, though, is in a lot of cases, we're not a good match for the grant. And that's equally important to understand so that you don't put a lot of staff resource and support into something where the scoring criteria are such that we may not be successful. We think the timing is really appropriate for us to look at some support. One, as many of you know, the president has signed the infrastructure bill. So we anticipate a significant amount of infrastructure grants in the next year or two coming out. We are also currently identifying and seeing a number of new park and rec programs that have some potential funding structure. And we are also seeing a fair amount of money available from the state for programs including housing. And that's an area where we really could use some support for that area, as well as one that Public Works and I are quite excited about, which is the rural water, where if we're successful with some of these grants, they would get projects done that are in our CIP or proposal. And in this particular case, if we could avoid having to pay for those through a ratepayer rates, those would be a positive. So as the mayor identified, the current proposal is actually a 2-part proposal. It is actually a recommendation for an 18-month agreement that is severable on a month-to-month basis. And it identifies a funding of $25,000 and some small change for this fiscal year. And then if we continue the relationship, it would be another $52,000 for next fiscal year that would be funded out of next fiscal year. Happy to answer any questions you might have with regard to the proposal.
Thank you, Steve. And I just wanted to add on that both Steve and I had conversations separately and then one together with the representative from California Consulting at the Cal Cities annual conference. And he and another staff member of his, they're very impressive and seem to be actually quite familiar with the North Bay and even Yountville in particular. And so that's encouraging to know that we have somebody that isn't just doing kind of cookie cutter grant writing, as Steve identified, that might in some cases have no real opportunities for us, and it would be a waste of time and money. So,
Mayor, they also like the fact that we have a reasonable understanding of grant approach. That makes us being able to sit down, provide information, a very helpful relationship with them. I should have mentioned also, it's in the staff report, but a number of local agencies also contract with them, including the County of Napa, and most recently the City of Sonoma, the City of Fairfield, City of Vacaville, Orinda, and the Novato Fire Protection District. And we will be principally served out of their Sacramento and Bay Area office.
Thank you. Questions, Councilmember Moeller? You're muted, Councilmember Moeller.
I forgot to lower my hand, so no question. But I
Okay.
really like the project.
Okay, question, Vice Mayor.
Thank you for the report. I too like the concept. I have some questions. Was the actual contract in the attachments? I saw a proposal and a resolution, but I did not see an actual contract.
That's correct, Vice Mayor, because we finalized the contract using our professional service templates after the approval. So that's standard.
Okay. And I'm still not clear. To me, what you're asking for is an 18-month contract.
As I indicated, if we're entering into this, there's two parts. One is the funding authorization of $25,200. In essence, you're correct. It is an 18-month contract. We need the funding amendment for the 6 months of this fiscal year, and then it would be included in the budget for next year. So yes, but I also want to be very clear. It also is a month-to-month contract. So if something were to happen and we're not happy with it, we have the ability to exit the agreement.
And I think I think this probably is a question for the town attorney, because as I read the agenda item, it says an amount not to exceed 25.2 for the remainder of this year. But it also says approving a contract, which we don't have, for purposes of grant writing. So I'm not sure how those go together with what the agenda says and the approval that we're actually talking about.
So as I read the agenda title and the staff report together, I think what the council is approving this afternoon is the not to exceed amount in the agenda title, which will be reflected in the agreement. And then for next year's budget cycle, if the council chose to do so and include it in the budget, then a new amount would be approved at that time for a subsequent not to exceed for the next fiscal year. And I think that's what the town manager's intent was, but correct me if I'm wrong.
That's correct. Or if you wanted to approve modify the dollar amount to reflect both, but that is the discretion. We're only looking for the funding for this fiscal year, and then we will obligate the contract for next fiscal year at 52 on some change. So
I don't think we could actually change that because that's not agendized. So
Right.
I think that what we have before us is only the 25,200 for the balance of this fiscal year, and we'll keep it at that. Go ahead, Vice Mayor.
Yes, that's my thinking, is we cannot approve funds more than $25,200. So, and that's not enough to support an 18-month contract. To me, all we can approve is 6-month contract and 6 months of funding.
Agreed, and that is what's before us.
Okay, so a 6-month contract. All right. And one other question. Do you expect that if we get more grants, we will need more staff to support? Because there's some language in the proposal about you'll meet with us and you'll do this and you'll do that, which I think is highly appropriate. I'm just asking about your staffing forecast.
no, I do not anticipate this leading to a request for additional staff. When it talks about we will meet with them, a successful grant requires us providing information, context, content, pictures, and various things like that. So that's amount, part of what we hope is that our effort will be more focused and therefore allow us to be successful. And obviously, if we are successful, then we will be putting our projects into our annual work plan.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and certainly over the years, we've seen that this is a very technical area that if even what seems to be minor language is not properly written, it may we may lose the opportunity to receive grant funding. And I see this as actually saving the need to have additional full-time staff, because we're doing it in a very targeted way and limiting the time that our staff will have to put in to support it. Councilmember Knight.
Thank you, Mayor. I do support this program too. Looking at all the potential programs, projects we could be asking grant money for, it just seems the dollar for dollar investment is and the cost benefit, and now the cost benefit is significant, that we could see a significant benefit for just the dollars we are investing. Just one point of clarification, following up with the Vice Mayor's question. So does the resolution title have to reflect that there is copy down below in item D that talks about additional funding for the 22-23 fiscal year? Does the resolution title, is that sufficient for what we're approving today?
Gary?
I believe so. Let me pull up the resolution specifically that is being asked.
The resolution title doesn't reference the funding for fiscal year 22-23.
So we're not dealing with 22-23. I know Steve talked about that as a future, but we are not allocating anything for 22-23 right now. He was just explaining that we will be discussing that during our budget workshop conversation. So this doesn't have anything to do with the additional funding for next fiscal.
Right. The resolution is clear about the funding for the remainder of this fiscal year and authorization to enter into the contract.
Correct.
So it's just item D. It's just, then I apologize, just to clarify, in the last sentence of item D, it talks about, it references a dollar amount for fiscal year 22-23 and a total amount of contract costs. So that's fine. I support this project. I just curious why that language is there, if maybe it's more appropriate for conversation after when we're talking our budget planning for next year.
And I think you're correct, Councilor Knight, and I would suggest that we strike the second half of paragraph D for that very reason. Appreciate the Vice Mayor and you bringing that up. I would suggest that the sentence "staff recommends an initial 18-month," that whole sentence, two sentences, be stricken, and so that section D of that ends at successful competitive grant applications that have received funding, period. Gary, do you see where, and are you okay with that?
Yes, that change is fine.
Yep, that makes sense. Yep, fully understand.
Yeah, thank you, Councilor Knight and Vice Mayor, for bringing that point up. Councilor Dornbecker?
Actually, I had the same question. I just wanted to confirm that for 2022-23, that will come up in our budget negotiations beginning after January, right?
That is correct. You're getting a Reader's Digest version of what you might expect to see in your future budget.
Okay, great. Thanks. That's all.
Yes. Yeah, we are only talking about the $25,200 for the balance of this fiscal year. I don't see any other hands. So any public comment on this, Eddie?
We did not receive any public comment for this, Mayor.
Thank you. Then I'll entertain a motion to consider adoption of this resolution.
Mayor, I'll make that proposal. I move approval of resolution number 21-4088, approving a contract with California Consulting for purposes of grant writing and management support in the amount not to exceed $25,200 for the remainder of fiscal year 21-22, and to allocate $25,200 from the annual assigned for budget contingencies fund to fund the contract cost and waive the reading.
Second.
Motion by Councilmember Knight, second by Vice Mayor Dorman. Eddie, a voice vote, please.
Councilmember Knight,
Yes.
Vice Mayor Dorman,
Yes.
Councilmember Dornbecker,
Yes.
Councilmember Mueller,
Yes.
Mayor Dunbar.
Yes. That passes unanimously. Thank you very much. And thank you for the clarification in that language. Now we know one of the things we're going to be talking about in a couple of months. Okay, we have no staff informational reports, correct, Steve? That's still the case?
That is correct.
Thank you. We'll move on to council meeting reports and comments. I do not have a report from Napa County Flood Control and Water Conservation District. Do we have a report from Upper Valley Waste Management Authority?
No, we do not. We are meeting in December.
Okay, I'll move on to, do we have Watershed Information and Conservation Council? Councilmember Dornbecker?
No, we do not have a report.
Okay, thank you. Cal Cities update. Very briefly, two things I wanted to mention. We unfortunately had to cancel our annual bocce tournament. It's the City Pack fundraiser due to the inclement weather that did show up on that weekend. That was a couple weekends ago. So that was a little bit unfortunate for us in the North Bay Division. It's always a very popular fundraiser that we all get to enjoy and host here in Yountville. Also, I wanted to let folks know, as Steve alluded to, the Federal Infrastructure and Jobs Act of a little over $1 trillion. And we used to never talk about trillions, but we do now. $1 trillion in funding. There are significant funds that are going to be available to the state of California. I suggest one place to look for the breakdown of what's coming to California is at calcities.org, which is the League of California Cities website. There are many emails and many organizations that are sending out emails that are breaking down what areas of funding are coming to California. So I think it makes sense, if you're interested, to check those out. And we'll be working not only with Cal Cities, but with our state legislators in Napa County to see what funding that we're able to get here locally. That's the only update I have for Cal Cities. I have one ad hoc committee update, and that's just that Councilor Dornbecker and I will be attending the County Climate Action Committee meeting this Friday at 9 a.m. One of the key agenda items there is the greenhouse gas inventory presentation and discussion about funding for some of that reporting. That's one of, that was kind of, I thought, the biggest of the three items. There's also an, seems like every meeting we talk about EV charging stations. That might just be to keep leaving it on the template for the agenda, but we'll be talking about that as well. Are there any other ad hoc or committee meetings that I have missed?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, seeing no others, I did want to just start off with a couple reports and announcements. Yes, Councilor Dornbecker.
Well, on the subject of the Climate Action Plan, I received a request from a student organization that's made a video on climate change, and they would like to present it to our council. They've presented it to every other council in the Napa Valley, and so they would really like to. I've seen it. It's worthwhile. It's not take a long time, and I'd like to be able to invite them to show it to our council and our people who watch our public, negotiations. But I'm hoping that we could talk about that at a future meeting or bring it back.
Yes, as I shared with you when you made the request, the presentation is not a very balanced presentation, to be honest. It is advocating a particular perspective from the two high school students. I know that they have requested it be shown at all the council meetings, and I've asked that if we are going to hear that presentation, that we get a more balanced presentation from the county as well as those students. And so we'll be discussing the appropriateness of that presentation. It could be that we have that agendized for December 7th, but as I stated, Councilor Dornbecker, I'd like to have further discussion about that to make sure that it's a fair and reasonable presentation, because as we both saw it, it is very much presenting a very specific position about the environment and climate change. So I just wanted to be fair and balanced. That's all. So, but thank you for addressing that. Other reports that I have, one thing that may sound boring, but it's certainly critically important is redistricting. And that's happening at the county level as well as the state and the national level. I would encourage everyone to go to either the county website or the state website. You can also just Google redistricting maps and check these out. There are proposals for redistricting. The Board of Supervisors today had a presentation and discussion about the 5 districts as they are being proposed to be modified here in Napa County. It relates to us in that there may be a slight expansion of District 3, which is our district, that would drop down a little bit further into North Napa. There may be some changes also between Districts 1 and I think it was 5. We're talking about fairly minimal changes, but the ultimate goal is to have a balance of the population in each of the 5 districts. And so District 3, which is the northern half of the valley and the county, has lower population numbers, so it's a much larger square mile area, a lot more density down in the southern part of the county. And so they're looking to modify some of the streets and neighborhoods down in a couple of the southern districts. Also, what I've seen so far, and again, this is for everyone to evaluate on their own, but there are no significant modifications being proposed currently for the state Senate district, which is Senator Dodd's. Also, it appears now that the state assembly district is not going to be modified in a significant way, at least as it would impact us. Originally, there was a concept that might have removed the city of Winters, which would mean our current assembly member, Cecilia Aguilar Curry, could no longer represent us here because that is her hometown. The last map that I saw yesterday has Winters back in our district. So that if that holds, then we will continue to have our current state legislator representation. However, at the congressional level, while Congressman Thompson would most likely continue to represent us with Lake, Solano, and Sonoma counties, there is a possibility, there is a map that shows Marin County being added to our district here. And so there are people that feel like that's not a very good idea. Some people probably embrace the idea, but that would be a more substantial change. I'm not making a comment one way or the other, but just so people are aware to pay attention to that. And you can submit comments by email, and the Vice Mayor gets to stand up and wave her arms on my behalf to turn the lights back on. It's good to have a partner in here today. But I suggest if this is of interest to you, you check that out and potentially submit comments. The county Board of Supervisors will be, the plan is to have that districting map vote on December 7th, because there is a December 15th deadline for the elections office to have the districts finalized in time for the 2022 elections. So it's important. And this is all based on changes in the 2020 census, the population numbers. So Councilmember Dornbecker.
Yes, I also saw on the congressional redistricting map that there was a proposal to remove Sonoma from our group. So Napa, Sonoma, Solano, and Napa, Solano, and what was the
Lake
fourth
County.
one? But Lake County.
Lake.
But has that changed? I haven't seen anything that's changed.
The latest map
Do we
that I
know?
saw did not remove Sonoma County from the district. It just added Marin. But there have been some modifications over just the last few weeks. So that's why we have to keep looking at it. There were several versions that were referenced at the Board of Supervisors, and they wanted to make sure that people were looking at the current, most up-to-date, because there are some very slight modifications even in the county with different neighborhoods, like I said, that might be shifting from one to another. It would impact mostly District 1 and District 3 next year, because those are the two seats that are up for election, and then the other 3 districts would not be until 2024. Okay, so with that, a lighter note, the town and tree lighting is coming up 6 p.m. this Sunday. I probably should have let Samantha make that announcement. Samantha, could you tell us, have you been in communication with Santa, and is everything ready to go?
We have been in communication with Santa, and everything is ready to go on schedule for 6 p.m.
Excellent. And that will kick off our 6 weeks of holidays in Yountville. That is sponsored by our Yountville Chamber of Commerce. Also, we're getting additional marketing support for the month of November from Visit Napa Valley. And I know the Vice Mayor and I and others, especially, we had a very strong showing. 2 of us from the council, but I think there were about 5 from the Arts Commission, 5 or 6 from the Arts Commission that were there. And so it was a good representation down at the Welcome Center to kick off the Yountville Dreaming marketing month. So holidays in Yountville, look forward to a lot of fun activities as we do every year. And we'll be lighting the town up this Sunday evening. And I want to thank our Public Works crew for bringing in the stunt Christmas tree next to our still growing living tree. It's coming along, but I think the rain is helping. I don't know if it's going to be majestic by next Sunday, but soon. Also, let's see, what else do I have here? Wreaths Across America. Also, you can see that reference through our Chamber of Commerce, but the Yountville Veterans Cemetery at our Veterans Home is going to be participating in the Wreaths Across America program, and at 9 o'clock on Saturday, December 18th, there will be a presentation, and more details to come on that. I don't know if that is open to the public or not.
They are taking volunteers, Mayor, if you go to wreathsacrossamerica.org.
Yes, so there are volunteers,
yes,
volunteers to place the wreaths, but in terms of the public being available, I think it's limited to those volunteers, and getting a nod from the Vice Mayor on that. So you do need to sign up to be a volunteer. You also can sponsor wreaths, which I know some folks, including myself, have done. I believe the Chamber has done so as well. Anyway, so that is something that's really important for us to support that effort right here at our own Veterans Home. Those are all the announcements and reports that I have. Does the council have any other reports before I recognize Vice Mayor Dorman? Anyone else? Okay, Vice Mayor Dorman, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mayor. And thank you really, Mayor, staff, consultants, everyone for allowing me, although I don't think those of you at home can necessarily see it. Hold on, I'm just going to show you that I'm actually here in Chambers today. So this is very exciting, and it's very good to be back. So that said, I have a letter that I have written to you, all of you here in Yountville, and I would like to read it to you, which is a departure from me. I pride myself on being able to memorize, but this is too important, I think, for me to go by memory. So some of it I will read to you. Dear Yountville, for me, you were love at first sight. Devin and I came here on vacation in the spring of 2010, and we went home with a house. We moved here full-time on June 1st, 2013, and were fortunate to buy a larger home in town a couple of years later, and we have never looked back. Yountville, you have embraced us, encouraged us, exceeded our expectations, our hopes, and our dreams in every way. You have allowed us to stretch and to grow and to count more dear friends than we ever thought possible. Thank you, Thank you. And so it is both with joy to have been with you and sadness to leave you that Devin and I begin preparations to say farewell. Now, you all know me well enough by now that I do try to choose my words carefully. And so farewell is the word I've chosen because my absolute wish for you, Yountville, is that in every way you farewell far into the future. I came here to retire and taste wine. One of them I have been very good at, and one of them not so much. And I'll let you can pick which I have been better at. But I did start writing right away after I came to Yountville for the Yountville Sun. I did the Chronicle report. I sat right on that back row for quite a long time. And then in 2015, when Lewis Chilton left his seat on the council, I thought that I could be of service by moving from the back row to one of the seats up here. I threw my hat in the ring. At that time, there were 4 council members to appoint someone, 3 of whom I serve with today. I came in dead last, 3rd out of 3. But that did not deter me from wanting to serve this town. So I applied for and was appointed to the ZDRB. The next year, I was fortunate and I decided there was another opening on council. I ran unopposed. And my first meeting in this very chair was December 2016. In December, and I sat here way out on the wing, which I kind of enjoyed. I sat here until December 2018 when my fellow council members selected me for vice mayor. A great honor, really, one of the great honors of my life. And then I was selected again last December 2020, to remain as vice mayor. Another great honor. I have loved this town. Every moment I have had the privilege to live and serve here. Every minute. I've learned so much from all of you, residents, businesses, veterans. We are all in it together. And as I think about saying farewell to you, I can't help but also think about what's going to happen in our future. Many of you know I had planned to ask for and earn your vote for mayor next year. Circumstances are such that that doesn't seem like it's going to be, but I am confident that you will make the most of your opportunity to choose new leaders. I'm confident that you will choose leaders who are first and foremost public servants. They run for office for the right reasons, for the sole purpose of making sure that Yountville fares well. I know you will consider a candidate's history as you consider their fitness to lead you and your town into the future. You will look at what's written on a campaign sign, you will hear what you hear in an electioneering speech, but you will remember and look back at what has brought everything to that point. You will know if words are contrary to actions. I hope you make it known to those who ask for your vote that a position of leadership is an honor bestowed solely by you, the citizens. It must be earned every single day. Leading and caring for our town is not a right. It is a privilege. I hope you insist on leaders who are committed to working together and who come to this chamber only to work for you. I hope you choose leaders who have a commitment to communicate and collaborate with one another on your behalf. Our town will fare well only with leaders who are not petty, who do not posture, who do not seek or sow division, and who respect you, really listen to you, and want to sit down with you and talk. I hope you look for leaders who put you first. We all have egos. I mean, that's a given. But when you come in this room, in my view, I hope you pick a leader who's willing to try to put that aside for the good of this town. And I know that you will not settle for less than that. I am proof that you are open to individuals who are unknown in political circles, who have never served before, but who have the business and life experiences that make them qualified to give it their best shot to serve and lead. I thank you for your confidence in me. And I know that you will afford that same open-mindedness to the next group of candidates who come forward. I hope that you insist on leaders who bring candor, civility, fair play, integrity, smarts, compassion, a strong work ethic, and a genuine love and concern for all things Yountville to the 3 seats that will be open, our mayor and 2 council members. Leaders owe the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, to coin a phrase, to all of us. And I hope that you insist on the whole true story from those who seek to lead. Whether half-truths, opinions presented as facts, untruths, those are not the stuff of good leadership. And I know that you know that. Most of all, I know that you know that as wonderful as our town is, we must initiate and respond to changes around us and within us. So I hope that you will select leaders who bring new ideas based both in creativity and in empirical data, new ideas about how to honor our past, improve our present, meet our future, and remain a vibrant, viable, absolutely unique and wonderful hometown and destination. Yountville, there is truly no other place like you. Where else would newcomers like Devin and me be embraced literally by a founding family? Where else would the town newspaper give 2 people who had never written a syllable the chance at a byline? Where else would COVID bring together a really disparate Friday night pod that still gets together week in, week out? And where else would we feel the blessings and energy and love that every smile and wave and hug and handshake and kind word brings? Truth? Nowhere else but here. You, Yountville, are your citizens, warm hearts, strong spirits, encircling arms, raucous conga lines, love for a good laugh, sharing sorrows, and of course, gathering frequently for wine and cheese. I will tell you, I have never said the word charcuterie as many times as I have said it in the last 10 years, and I probably never will again. I am changed for the better, so much for the better, by having lived the joy of being one of your own. And I will always, always cherish these days in my heart. All this to say, Yountville, although Devin and I are changing our residence, my first love for you has not waned, and it never will. Our dates to actually move and for me to resign from the council are not final. We will share those as soon as we know. But our house is on the market. I think word may have gotten around town about that, but our house is on the market, and we have decided on our next step. As with many major life decisions, a number of factors converged to help Devin and me know that as difficult as it is, this decision is the right one for us and our family. You know me, I want to keep on talking to you all. So whether individuals, small groups, in person, telephone, Zooms, reach out to me via email, kdorman@yville.com. If you'd like to, we'll figure out a time to get together. I love getting together with you and sharing thoughts about Yountville and beyond. I am counting, I will say selfishly, I am counting on another chance to talk to you at one more council meeting. Because surprise, there's so much more I want to say, including so many people I want to say thank you to. And again, selfishly, I really have got to get my hands on that bottle of wine that seems to appear across the Zoom. So perhaps I will get that opportunity. Yountville, I hope you know that we love you and we will miss you when that time comes. And until we talk again, please farewell.
Thank you very much, Vice Mayor. So I will awkwardly, after your eloquence, continue on our agenda. But I do want to thank you for your comments and look forward to that opportunity to truly recognize all that you've done for the council and for the town. So
thank you. It is my absolute honor, and to serve with you, Mayor, and all of our council and staff, absolute honor. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we awkwardly move forward with much less important information. Sorry, but,
Mayor, I might suggest that you just say, here's housing.
Right. Gary, don't try to top that. I definitely would suggest not to, but we do have one more item on our business agenda today, and that is a presentation on housing legislation. You know, it's very critical, the issue, and you're going to provide some updated information on what it means to Yountville. Gary.
Yes, thank you, Mayor and council members. We will be talking about housing for the remainder of this meeting. I understand that members of the ZDRB are here as well, perhaps some of them, so welcome and thanks for joining us. I will be sharing my screen as I have a presentation on my side.
And while you're doing that, Hillary, if it's possible for you to put your name in the window, if you see the 3 dots in the upper right corner of your video box, if that's where it is, and you go to rename, and if you could just pop your name in there so the public can identify you. Thank you.
All right. Can everyone see the presentation and hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah.
All right, so we'll go ahead and get started this evening. We're going to talk briefly about legislation generally in Sacramento, and then a distinction between ministerial and discretionary, or another way of saying it is objective and subjective. The reason why these terms are important is because state law now uses them a lot. One of them is how the town used to review these types of applications regarding housing. And for some types of applications that will continue, but for certain types of application that has changed. And state law is the one that's imposing that requirement on the town and every other city in the state of California and county as well. So we're all in this boat together, as there's just somewhat of a sea change recently in how certain applications are considered at the local level. So ministerial approval generally means that there's a set of standards and the town is simply deciding whether or not those standards are met. If the answer is yes, the application is approved. This does not involve discretion in any way, simply a checking of boxes. A, B, C, and D, if yes to all, the application is approved. Discretionary is the other side of that, and that's what every local jurisdiction has been used to doing forever. And that's when you apply things like your use permit findings or your design review findings, things like, would it be injurious to the public health? Does it fit well into the neighborhood? These types of things. That's all discretionary because it requires you as decision makers to look at the facts, the application before you, and then apply those standards, which requires you to make a subjective judgment about whether or not the application meets them. It's that type of discretion that the state legislature has removed for certain types of applications that are in front of you. We'll get to that in a little bit later on in the presentation. But another way of thinking about this is objective and subjective. The legislature uses these terms. We'll talk about them a bit later. You'll see them in state law, and you'll also see them in applications and the municipal code and the Zodo update that just occurred. Objective meaning anyone would know what it is just by reading it. It's not open to doubt or debate. It is what it is, and there aren't two perspectives on what it is. Subjective is the opposite of that. Is this met or not? Those are the types of standards you're used to applying for use permit and design review. So we'll talk about these in more detail here in a moment. So we're going to talk primarily tonight about two things. The Housing Accountability Act, that's been the main state law that's been revised and now changes how the town reviews these applications. Senate Bill 9, that's been getting a lot of press, so we'll go into some detail about what it does. But I wanted to note briefly two other things that exist, three other things that exist that we're not going to talk about tonight. They'll be part of later presentations during the housing kickoff, and your new planning director will go into more detail on these later. But SB 35 streamlining applies to a project with 50% or more affordable. That's a ministerial approval. So if the requirements are met, the town must approve it. The town can apply objective standards to those types of applications, and there's several exceptions in there, including for housing that's been used for rental in the last 10 years and a few others. So those are a certain type of application that we're not going to go into detail tonight, but it does exist. The density bonus law and the town's inclusionary housing ordinance. Whenever a certain number of units are proposed, 5, a certain percentage of them must be affordable. That's imposed by the town's inclusionary housing ordinance. The density bonus law then gives an additional units than would otherwise be allowed in that zone, depending on how much affordable units are provided in the application. And another way of saying that is if you've got 10 units, 3 are affordable, you'll get extra units on top of that as a density bonus for offering those affordable units. That's why it's called the density bonus law. There's concessions and incentives and waivers that go along with it. We could do a whole presentation on SB 35 and then a whole nother one on the density bonus law and the town's inclusionary housing ordinance, but we're not going to do that. We're going to focus on the Housing Accountability Act and Senate Bill 9. I just wanted to mention that those two things exist. So as we talk about affordable units and things, these laws are out there. They also apply. All right, so the Housing Accountability Act was adopted in 1982. This law has been around for a while, but the legislature recently picked it back up about 4 years ago, and they have amended it significantly over the past 4 years, 7 times in fact. Housing Crisis Act of 2019 was one of the more recent amendments to it, happened again this year with the bills that were signed by the governor this last fall. According to HCD, that's the Housing and Community Development Department, here's what the Housing Accountability Act does in a nutshell, one sentence. It establishes the state's overarching policy that a local government, that's the town, may not deny, reduce the density of, or make infeasible housing development projects, emergency shelters, or farm worker housing that are consistent with objective local development standards. There's a lot of information. That's the standard. We're going to unpack each of those in turn as we go along, but that's basically what the Housing Accountability Act does. This is the flow chart that HCD has provided for deciding how to interpret and understand a project that's subject to its provisions. I provided here, not because you all can stand here and read it all tonight, but so that you have it as part of this presentation, which will be made available. It is helpful. It gives you a step-by-step guide for the types of standards and decisions that must be made for these types of projects, all the way through to your final decision on that project. It's a helpful tool, not only for staff, but for all of you who are reviewing these projects and will be soon. So the Housing Accountability Act only applies to a housing development project. That's a defined term in the law. And here's what it means. A use consisting of residential units only, mixed use developments consisting of residential and non-residential uses with at least 2/3 of the square footage for residential use, or transitional or supportive housing. Key takeaway here is that units is used plurally in the statute. That means that the application has to seek 2 or more units in order for the Housing Accountability Act to apply. It's another way of saying an application for one single family home, since it's only 1 unit, would not be subject to the Housing Accountability Act. So a development project also includes transitional housing and supportive housing. These are the definitions for those 2 types of applications if the town ever receives them. These are also subject to the rules that we'll be talking about today. So the Housing Accountability Act creates standards for affordable units. So those types of projects that propose affordable units and those types of projects that do not propose affordable units. Those are default standards that both types of projects must follow. And then there's special standards that apply to only those projects that are proposing affordable. So very low and moderate income households and affordable units under the HAA, the Housing Accountability Act, means at least 20% of them are sold or rented to lower income households. That's 30%, 60% of the average median income, or 100% of the units sold or rented to persons and families of moderate income or persons and families of middle income, 30% of 100% of AMI. Those amounts are determined by HCD. There are detailed provisions in the Health and Safety Code for how HCD reaches those numbers. It's based on income, other data, and they crunch them and produce lists that talk about what these AMI are in order to reach these percentages. So if the project proposes affordable units with the percentages that we just talked about in the slide before, here are the standards that the town must apply for those types of affordable units. And the town cannot disapprove that type of project unless it can make one of these findings. The town has a compliant housing element and has met all of its RHNA allocation for all income categories proposed for the project. And you can probably see where the legislature is going with this. For RHNA allocations and meeting those numbers, you know, the different jurisdictions are at different points in their compliance with those RHNA numbers and meeting their targets. So what the legislature is saying here is, if you're going to disapprove an affordable housing project in front of you, got to have a compliant housing element. You also have to have met all of your RHNA numbers. The second finding that you could possibly make is that the project has a specific adverse impact on public health or safety, and there's no feasible way to mitigate it. Denial is required to comply with a specific state or federal law, and there's no other feasible method to comply. The proposal is on land zoned for agricultural, or there is inadequate water or sewer to serve the project, or the project is inconsistent with zoning and general plan land use designation not listed in the housing element, and there's no adequate alternative sites to accommodate the RHNA allocation. That's it. Those are the 5 findings, at least one of which would need to be made in order to deny an affordable housing project. Assuming one of those findings can be made, and if you're reviewing a project that does not propose affordable units, but just proposes 2 or more units, these are the default standards that apply to all of these types of projects, including non-affordable. The first question is whether or not the project is consistent with objective general plan, zoning, subdivision, and design review standards. If the answer is yes, it meets all of your objective standards, the town cannot disapprove the project unless it can make both of these findings. There's a specific adverse impact on public health or safety, and there is no feasible method to satisfactorily mitigate or avoid the adverse impact. So the first issue there is really about objective standards. Now, in the Zoto update that the town council recently approved, there's a whole set of objective standards that staff cultivated with the ad hoc committee and created specifically in anticipation for these types of projects. So the town is actually ahead of the game regarding these types of projects and objective standards. Many jurisdictions don't have these or don't have many objective standards at all. Without them, the project would comply with them. If you don't have any objective standards, then it would comply with them because there aren't any to impose on the project. But in this case, the town does have objective standards specifically. So first question is, does it comply with these? If it does, you can only deny it if you can make these two findings. So what does objective mean for purposes of the Housing Accountability Act? Now, the legislature has used this same phrase in SB 35 streamlining, also in SB 9, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And this is their new phrase that they're using to take away local control. It's the short way of saying that. And objective under the Housing Accountability Act and many other state laws means involving no personal or subjective judgment by a public official and being uniformly verifiable by reference to an external and uniform benchmark or criterion available and knowable by both the development applicant or proponent and the public official. And I guess when you use uniformly and uniform in the same sentence, you definitely are serious, and the legislature is for this definition. They've made it very clear that it's really the very as opposite as you can be from subjective. That's what they mean when they're using objective here. So there are timelines under the Housing Accountability Act that are a little bit different than the Permit Streamlining Act, which is the state law that governs how quickly the town must normally review projects. So an application under the Housing Accountability Act is deemed complete if a preliminary application is submitted under the Permit Streamlining Act, and that freezes all standards and fees while a proponent assembles the remaining information with 180 days. This concept of a preliminary application allows an applicant to submit the information in state law. There's a checklist there of about 12 different things that's submitted. If that checklist is met, they get 180 days to finish it, but it freezes everything when that preliminary application is submitted. That's important because it freezes the objective standards that are on the book, all the fees that the town council has imposed, any other standards that might apply to that project. But the developer isn't required to submit a preliminary application. If they don't, the application is determined to be complete when it's found complete under the Permit Streamlining Act. And without going into a lot of detail on that, there's a back and forth between staff and the applicant where certain information is required. Staff will notify the applicant, hey, you need to submit this additional information. They have 30 days to do so, and there's a back and forth until it's done. Once it's complete, then the application is frozen at that moment. That's the normal process under the Permit Streamlining Act, but there's this new concept of a preliminary application. And why are these deadlines important? Because that's when the town has to decide if the project is consistent with the objective standards, which is really what flows from whether or not it can be denied based on the health and safety findings that have to be made. So if the local agency, the town, determines that the project is inconsistent, not in compliance, or not in conformity with programs, policies, ordinance, or standards, or other similar provisions, must provide written documentation within 30 days of the project determined to be complete if there's 150 or fewer housing units, or 60 days if there's more units. Otherwise, it's deemed consistent. This is a new provision in the Housing Accountability Act. These are pretty tight deadlines. The application's deemed complete or determined to be complete. The very short window there of 30 days to tell the applicant, here's the standards you meet, here's the standards you don't meet if there aren't any. If this is not included in a letter and no determination is made, the application will be deemed consistent with everything that's not included in the letter, and if no letter is sent, with everything that could apply to the project. It's a big deal for purposes of your later decision on that project. So CEQA still applies to these projects, still discretionary in the sense that you're going through a discretionary process. These applications are still going through ZDRB, town council, your normal process. The difference is the types of standards you're applying and the findings that you would have to make to deny the project. You're still going through the normal process. It's still discretionary in the legal sense. And of course, CEQA applies to all discretionary actions. So CEQA still applies to this. The project is denied under the Housing Accountability Act. Not surprisingly, when you vote to deny it, but also when you fail to meet deadlines for acting on the project after CEQA approval. Permit Streamlining Act says if you approve CEQA, you have a certain amount of time after that, 180 days or so, to do final action on the project, or it's deemed to be denied. Similar thing happens here. Most of the time, your CEQA and your project approvals are going concurrently, and so this isn't going to be an issue, but theoretically. So something to consider. We talked a little bit at the beginning about what objective is. You saw the definition in the Housing Accountability Act of objective. And then we talked about subjective and discretionary review as well. So if you think about the standards that you're used to seeing, the findings that you're used to applying at the town council level and also at the ZDRB for a variance or a use permit or design review or any of the other discretionary approvals that you do, you're used to seeing findings like will not be detrimental to health, will not be detrimental or injurious to property. The use is compatible with existing and future land uses in the vicinity or the zone, would maintain and enhance the community's character, provide for harmonious and orderly development. So these are all subjective. These are not objective standards. These are the standards that you can still apply to single-family homes. But for 2 or more units that are being proposed, this is what the Housing Accountability Act has changed. And those are the objective standards that are now adopted in the new ZODA ordinance. So one way to think about this, and what staff already did with the consultant that helped with that update, and what the ad hoc committee and council has already done as well in adopting the ZODA ordinance, is to think about these performance and context-based criteria. It's another way of saying that's what these subjective criteria are. Is it harmonious? Is it injurious to health? Things like this. And replace them with like should, compatible within, and be specific. So things like should is not an objective standard. Compatible, how compatible is something with something else? That's a subjective application. Has to be within a certain, sometimes you'll see a standard that says, you know, within 10 feet of something. Well, you could comply with that in a lot of different ways. And that's part of why that's not an objective standard. But usually these things mean something specific. Usually you know what you're talking about. You know what's best for your town. You all are elected and appointed here to apply the community's interests and be the voice for the community's concerns. These standards do mean something. And usually, if you think about it, you can come up with an objective standard that's pretty close or actually matches what you mean. Rather than applying the subjective one, if you can formalize it into an objective standard, there's no reason not to, and there's nothing in the Housing Accountability Act that would stop you from doing that. So if you find yourself in the future with a subjective standard and all of you know exactly what it means, then reformulate it into an objective standard and put it in your code. And that's how you can continue to apply it and comply with the Housing Accountability Act. Also, adopting standards only for Housing Accountability Act projects. That's pretty common. Town's done that in the ZODA update. You can also do a similar thing for SB 9 projects, which we'll talk about in a second. And so that way it's clear what standards are being applied to certain types of projects. If you don't adopt a separate section like you've done, you have to scour the whole code for objective. Which ones are objective, which ones aren't. You can apply the objective ones, the other ones you can't. And it's quite a process. And so to simplify that, they are actually adopted in a single place. With some good foresight in the ZODA update. So the Housing Crisis Act of 2019 made a couple changes. We'll just talk about a few of them here. No more than 5 hearings if the housing development project complies with applicable objective general plan and zoning standards when the application is deemed complete. Now, the town has a CDRB and a town council, so this may not be as much of an issue, but for other jurisdictions that have design review and a planning commission and a council, and then an appeal or 1 or 2 appeals of those, you can quickly get to 5. The same standard applies to the town as well. And so that means no more than 5 hearings. If there was one and then an appeal, if the town council sent it back down to the ZDRB to consider a particular issue and it came back to the town council, you'd be at 4 at that point. So no more than 5 shouldn't be an issue generally in the way that the ZODO and the town considers these applications, but something to keep in mind, 5 is the limit. No more housing moratoria. There used to be a provision under the planning and zoning law at the state level that allowed moratoria on certain permits for housing and the like. That's been frozen. And no net loss housing unit and density intensity. So when you're rezoning or approving projects at lower densities and the like, you have to make specific findings that there's a possible density elsewhere in order to achieve the units that could have been built on the parcel that you're approving. And that's also an HCD requirement, and they will review and think about this. So if there's a project that's being approved on a parcel that could have 5, 6, 7 units, but you're approving less than that, you need to look at the income level for that parcel and what's being proposed and make a finding and analysis that there is another parcel in which those same units could be built and that it's possible. And that's the no net loss. It requires some thinking through of potential sites in the future and to think through the application that's been submitted to you before considering it. We're skipping through Senate Bill 8. I'm going to go to Housing Accountability Act enforcement. So we'll talk briefly about these cases. It is interesting to put the law in real facts. These are cities in the Bay Area, many of them, with the exception of one of them down south. And these are all recent decisions in the last 3 years, with the exception of one of them. So these are real facts, real city councils and planning commissions that are applying these standards to real applications in front of them. And I always think that can kind of be helpful to put this in context. And so we'll talk about a few of those cases. So who can enforce this law? The applicant who submitted the application. That's clear, that's normal. Anyone who would be eligible to apply for residency if the project were built. That's a little new. So if it were a affordable housing project for certain income levels, someone who would be eligible to move into the project were it built could also challenge. Or a housing organization can enforce this law as well. There's some writ practice here. Generally, that's a special kind of lawsuit that overturns decisions of the council. The questions that are asked in the lawsuit are, did you proceed in the manner required by law? In other words, here's the process. Those are the objective standards we talked about. Was your decision not supported by the findings? Did you apply the findings correctly, and was your decision supported by that? And were your findings not supported by the evidence? And that's the application in front of you, the staff report, the testimony, anything else you considered in reaching your decision. That's really the scope of what gets asked in one of these lawsuits. There's some interesting standards of review that most of the time only lawyers care about, but I'll mention to you briefly right now. In this statute, they require a preponderance of the evidence, more likely than not. But in the lawsuit, you only require substantial evidence, which means just there's good evidence to support it, not more likely than not. So the court is applying a standard to a different standard that you all are applying, which makes for kind of interesting litigation. It's something to consider as you apply these in making your decisions. One way to make a defensible record, ensure that there is an adequate administrative record to support each of the findings, each and every one of them, and explain the decision. We are making a finding that this application would seriously affect the health and safety of the community because, and use the word because, and then finish the sentence with the evidence that you have on the record before you. But really explaining the findings, supporting them with evidence in the record, that is the best you can do to support your decision should it be challenged later. That's true of all of your administrative decisions in the land use generally, but it just happens to be true for Housing Accountability Act cases as well. So we'll talk about 4 cases really quickly. First one is Honcharu versus Stanislaus County. This is the oldest of the Housing Accountability Act cases. There's a long history of litigation between this gentleman and Stanislaus County. There's at least 4 published cases. This is the most recent one. They've been suing each other for about 12 years now, and they're still at it. So he wanted to subdivide 33.7 acre parcels into 8 parcels, ranging in size from 0.5 acres to 5 acres, and including one 12-acre remainder that he didn't want to develop. So at this point, he's only subdividing property. There's nothing else being proposed at this point. Some of this property was zoned general agriculture, and some of it was zoned historical site district. The historical district properties were served by a community services district that issued a will not serve letter. So the CSD was the one who provided water. These are pretty rural parcels. The county wasn't providing water out there through a county service area or through some other provision. And the district was providing water. District said, we don't have any water. We cannot provide water to the subdivision. We can't do it. So there were concerns over traffic, water availability, and contamination from septic, because they didn't have sewer out there either, and maintaining the historical character of the area. The Planning Commission denied this subdivision. It's only a subdivision map under the Subdivision Map Act and the county's local ordinance. They denied it on a 6-2 vote. That decision was appealed to the Board of Supervisors, which unanimously disapproved the project. They found that the site was not physically suitable for the proposed development. That really had to do with the water. They're subdividing the project. They said, really, there's no water out there. And so how are these projects going to go forward with these different parcels? Only a subdivision map, though. So here's what the court found. First thing is, the Housing Accountability Act is not limited to affordable housing. It didn't matter that he wasn't proposing affordable units. It didn't matter that he was only subdividing property at this point. The HAA still applied. Housing units were being proposed because single-family dwellings were contemplated on each of these 8 lots. That was going to be a future entitlement. But here's the main finding. If a housing development project complies with objective standards, you can only deny it if you make 2 findings. Project would have specific adverse impact on public health or safety unless disapproved, and there's no feasible method to mitigate it. The Planning Commission and the Board of Supervisors did not make these findings. So the court sent it back and said, reconsider the application, make the findings if you think you can and you'd like to, and would like to disapprove the project, but you've got to make these findings if you're going to disapprove it when the project complies with objective standards. Not really sure where the litigation went after this. This was a little while ago. I would imagine this wasn't the end of it, but for purposes of our case, this is the takeaway from this one. So San Francisco Bay Area Renters Federation, which has an acronym that sounds a little different, and Berkeley. The overview of this case is there was a proposal to demolish 1 single residential unit and construct 3 residential units in its place. This presentation doesn't have pictures in it, but you can imagine Berkeley Street. I'm sure many of you have visited. No off-street parking, very narrow street. The existing houses on there are packed shoulder to shoulder. There's almost a 0 lot line, no yards, and they're all single units. Someone comes in, an investor comes in and buys one of these single units, wants to tear it down and put in 3 units. There's no parking already. They're already tight, but that's the application that's before the city of Berkeley. So the Zoning Adjustment Board approved it and said, this project complies with all objective general plan and zoning standards. We looked at them all, it complies with all of them. So therefore we're going to approve the project, including all the design review standards in effect when the application was deemed complete. They issued a use permit and approved it. Then public opposition rose, only at that point. So someone appealed it to the city council, which overturned the Zoning Adjustment Board decision, citing concerns over parking, privacy, light and view access, and crowding. All the things you would imagine based on what was being proposed on this very narrow street in Berkeley. What did the court say? The court said, well, when the project complies with applicable objective general plan and zoning standards and you're trying to deny it, you've got to make 2 findings. Adverse impact on public health and safety, no feasible method to mitigate it. City council didn't make those findings. And that's what the Housing Accountability Act requires. The trial court decision and there was a settlement for the city council to rehear the appeal. Lawsuit was filed. She said, you know what, why don't we go back, we'll have another hearing and we'll reconsider this project. On rehearing, the city council decided to take a slightly different tack on this. The city council vacated its resolution and denied the demolition permit. So it's sort of an interesting piece here. There was a use permit and also a demolition permit. It vacated the resolution denying and decided to only act on the demolition permit, probably thinking that a demolition permit isn't for housing and therefore we can deny it, but it is required in order for the housing to go forward. So they took the position that the demolition permit was not subject to the Housing Accountability Act. Not surprisingly, everyone went back to court after the city council tried that. The court orders the city to undertake the Housing Accountability Act analysis under the settlement. The city at that point decides to fold its tent and the settlement is entered into to construct the project. I think the takeaway here is apply the findings, but also can't piecemeal the project. If there is an application for a permit to build and a demolition permit and other related permits, they're all related as a whole. Certainly HCD takes that position that the application is considered as a whole, and otherwise it would defeat the purpose of the state law if you could do what the Berkeley City Council attempted to do here. So District Square LLC versus the City of Los Angeles. This was the first case under the more recent standards that were adopted in post-2017. The Director of Planning approved a permit for a 577 unit project in a mixed use building, finding that it met all objective standards and was exempt from CEQA. In the City of LA, the Director of Planning can approve an over-the-counter permit for a 577 unit project. And that is what happened. The project was within the allowable density, and the project was appealed at that point to the Planning Commission, which denied the project because of its impact on gentrification and displacement of existing residents. They did not issue a letter of determination until 6 months after their decision. So you probably remember from the slides earlier, given the timelines, and given that they were basing their decision on gentrification and displacement of existing residents, that we probably have a Housing Accountability Act problem here. Normally, the court will remand the case back and say, Planning Commission, reconsider your decision. And that has to do with separation of powers. The courts don't like to step in and tell you guys how to do your jobs any more than they like to hear from you about them doing their jobs. And so when they review decisions and they find a violation of the law, they will usually send it back for you to reconsider your decision and tell you, please rethink through this finding, for example, or make the findings. The court found that the project was deemed consistent with city policies, ordinance, and standards in effect. Why? Because the city didn't send a notice within 60 days. This is more than 150 units, so they had 60 days to make that determination. They didn't. What was the effect? Even if the project was inconsistent with these objective standards, which it may have been, you must approve it now unless you can make the health and safety findings because it's been deemed consistent. But interestingly here, the court ordered the city to approve the project. That's a very strange order from a court. It directed the city to approve it. And why? Because it found that the Planning Commission went on its own frolic and detour and knowingly and deliberately violated the law. Some other facts here, specifically there was staff recommendations and other recommendations at the hearing that made it very clear what standards were supposed to be applied. That of course was all documented and became part of the record. Planning Commission decided to disregard those findings and go in a different direction. The court took that into account. And this is the most recent case from this year. This is only from a few months ago, and it gives some interesting guidance on what an objective standard is. So I think it's worth noting. In this case, there was a proposal to build a 4-story, 10-unit apartment building. Staff reviewed the project, determined it complied with the general plan and design standards, recommended Planning Commission approval. Exactly what you would expect as it goes through. There was public opposition at the Planning Commission meeting, and the Planning Commission directed staff to prepare a resolution denying the project. The big issue before the Planning Commission, and also in the court case, is whether or not the project complied with the following design standard. if there is more than 1 story variation in height between adjacent buildings, if you're proposing a building and you have another building next to it that's more than 1 story variation in height up or down, a transition or step in height is necessary. That's what the design standard said, to quote, ease the transition. And the question is this an objective standard or not? Certainly, if you have adjacent buildings, I think that's objective, whether or not they're adjacent. Whether or not they're more than 1 height difference is also objective. It's the second part of that sentence that caused problems. A transition or step in height is necessary. What is a transition or step in height? That's what the court was looking at. So the Planning Commission denied the project, appealed it up to the City Council, which upheld the Planning Commission's denial, and the parties went to court. The trial court found that the design standard was objective, but on appeal, the court reviewed the history of general plans and the Housing Accountability Act, including a provision in the Housing Accountability Act that was put in by the Housing Crisis Act of 2019, that it must be read and construed to provide additional housing. So the courts took that seriously. It's now a provision in state law that says, hey, courts, when you're looking at this law, you should give it an interpretation and meaning that leads to more housing. That's what the state is trying to accomplish. So the court found that this design standard was not objective. This is the Court of Appeal at this point. It requires a transition or a step. So which one is required? Doesn't give guidance on what a transition is or a step. Gives no guidance on what meets that standard. And on top of that, the city took different positions at the Planning Commission, City Council, and then finally in court. And the court said, well, if you're taking different positions in all 3 forms, we're assuming it can mean different things, therefore it's not objective. All right, we will transition now from Housing Accountability Act, set that aside. We're going to transition now to SB 9, which is one of the housing bills that was recently signed by the governor. There's a few key takeaways in this law. We'll touch on the major provisions of it and what it means. There are now lot splits by right, which is another way of saying ministerial approval, in single-family residential zones. Ministerial approval of up to 2 units, a duplex in single-family residential zones, and a maximum of 4 dwelling units on the original single-family lot. If there's a lot split, there can be 2 units put on each of those lots, and that's the end of it. So 4 more units total. If that happens, the proponent cannot avail themselves of the ADU or the JADU law to put in additional units. So you get a duplex on each of the split lots, and that's it. If they're proposing a duplex on an existing single-family lot, then they may still avail themselves of the ADU or the JADU law, which could lead to a total of 4 units on the existing single-family lot that is not subject to a subdivision. That's why when you hear about this law in the news, you say, oh, 4 plexes and no more than 4 units. You'll hear that spoken quite a bit in the press and also by the legislators regarding this bill. That's what they're talking about. You can subdivide and get 2 on each, or you can put 2 on an existing and then an ADU and a JADU on the duplex that you put on the existing lot. So ministerial approval of 2 units in a single family residential zones, except, and these should now look very familiar because the legislature borrows and cribs from its other laws and puts them into new ones. You must approve the ministerial except when you can make written findings that the project would have specific, unmitigatable adverse impact on public health or safety or the physical environment, or the development would require demolition of more than 25% of the exterior walls of a structure, unless the unit has not been occupied by tenants within the last 3 years. So we've got an except standard that also has an unless in it. It's a little difficult to apply, but generally ministerial approval unless either of those things can be found. The town can still impose objective standards. That's the common theme between all of these laws: Housing Accountability Act, SB 35 streamlining, SB 9. can still apply objective standards. The town has objective standards. They will still apply to these projects. For purposes of SB 9, though, cannot apply objective standards that would preclude construction of up to 2 units, or that would physically preclude either of the 2 units from being at least 800 square feet in floor area. So that's really the floor of what this law authorizes. Still get your objective standards. There's a minimum of 2 units, minimum of 800 square feet. And it's possible that some objective standards would not be applied if that would be required in order to build those minimum. So there's 4 key areas in this law. There are standards, the location where it can happen, displacement, and overdevelopment. Talk about each of them. The new parcel must be at least 1,200 square feet and may not be smaller than 40% of the original parcel. So that's for the subdivision of properties that we're talking about. Town can require an off-street parking space, can't impose standards that would preclude up to 2 units and 800 square foot floor area. So we just talked about a 4-foot side and rear setback can still be applied. That should sound familiar from anyone who's been applying and updating the ADU ordinance over the years. That's the same setback minimum that the state now requires for ADUs. They've carried it over for SB 9 as well. And no setback is required from an existing structure, which is also similar to the ADU law. If you have a 0 lot line structure that's being converted to an ADU, generally that can be done as long as it's not being enlarged, because it must be in the same configuration and location. SB 9 carries that standard over. The parcel, lot, or development must be located in a single-family residential zone. SB 9 does not define the term single-family residential zone, but it does use it as a noun. So it means something specific. Generally, that means a zone where single-family homes are allowed and perhaps only single-family homes are allowed and not other types of uses like mixed use or like multifamily. But SB 9 doesn't define it. So we don't, it doesn't provide a definition. So we're left with the normal and usual meaning of single-family residential zone. Cannot be in a historic district or be a historic property, and no 1-car parking garage requirement for a new primary residential unit located within 1/2 mile of a high-quality transit corridor or 1 block of a car share location. A lot split cannot result in the demolition or alteration of a housing unit currently serving moderate, low, or very low income households or a rent controlled unit. Can't demolish housing that's subject to rent or price control. Cannot result in the demolition or alteration of housing that's been occupied by a tenant in the last 3 years, or if the unit has been removed from the market under the Ellis Act in the last 15 years. That's the provision of state law that allows landlords to convert existing rental housing stock and convert it back to other uses, for example. The town must require an affidavit from the applicant which states they intend to occupy one of the housing units. This is really an anti-developer investment speculator provision, right? So this is meant to prevent an outside investor from coming in, purchasing a parcel, subdividing it, putting 2 units on each and selling them off. The applicant for this process must submit an affidavit that states they intend to occupy one of the housing units as their principal residence for a minimum of 3 years from the date of the urban lot split. The parcel cannot have been created from a previous SB 9 lot split. So this is like a 1 and you're done under SB 9. If you split it once, can't do it again. And the same person cannot perform a lot split on adjacent lots. This is also to prevent a speculator coming in to a very long street, perhaps with 3 or 4 parcels next to each other and splitting them all and going through that process. Which of course shouldn't be possible if you're going to live in one of them as your primary residence for 3 years, but the same person on adjacent lots is another way of restating the first requirement too, but in a different way. So what is next in the world of housing legislation? Discretionary review is likely going to continue to change. There's more laws in Sacramento, 60 or so this last year. I would imagine as many next year. For those of you, and certainly the mayor and others on the council involved with Cal Cities, you know that this is a big topic. There's lots of legislation and there's going to be more. Objective standards are the new thing. You can still apply them to SB 9, Housing Accountability Act, SB 35, and so forth. The purpose of this, from the legislature's perspective, is so that developers know exactly what they need to do to put in a project. But from the town's perspective, since you can still apply them, if you can think through and adopt them and think about the ones you need for purposes of the town and what the town's interests are, you can continue to revise and update these now and in the future. So more legislation is coming. And then finally, there's a proposed state ballot measure to make all land use decisions local and to get the state out of this altogether. Whether or not that's successful and is ultimately approved will be seen at a future election. That's something that Cal Cities is following pretty closely too. And with that, I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Gary. Let me ask if there's relevance to the impacts of all the legislation you just described and the new RHNA cycle. Our units are going from 17 to I think 74 units required in an 8-year period. And also related to that, a number of cities, especially in the Southern California area, are suing the state or other agencies over these RHNA requirements. Does that have any impact on any of the laws you just described?
So I know that certainly these laws should increase housing, at least in the short term, and perhaps in the longer term too. So in terms of meeting that RHNA allocation and building those units to a certain extent, these laws should encourage and make them some of that housing easier to build. That's your question for that. I know that there are lots of cities who are suing, not only under SB 9, also under SB 35 streamlining, under a lot of these different laws. And the main purpose is to challenge these as a violation of local control and the city's police power. A lot of those are coming from charter cities specifically. They have more home rule control than a general law city, but there are other lawsuits too, and we'll see how those shape out in the coming years.
You also mentioned very briefly the minimum parcel sizes or lot sizes, and that is going to affect where these lot splits are likely to occur in typically more rural settings where the lot sizes are larger than in urban centers where they're typically smaller. Is that correct?
That's absolutely right. So there is a minimum lot size there. You're talking about no smaller than 40% of the original and 1,200 square feet. So yes, certainly smaller lots, ones where you've got existing homes that are largely cover the lot or nearly, some of these will be very difficult to apply and likely won't apply in a lot of the circumstances, just as a matter of physical ability to put them in. That goes as to the 4 units as well for SB 9. While the law would technically allow for up to 4 units on a particular parcel, whether or not you could fit 4 units given height limitations, given far built out in the 4-foot setbacks is another question. And in many cases, the answer to that will be no.
And one of the questions that we were discussing in the ad hoc committee is if we have certain restrictions like 2-story building, but then a developer says, I cannot build what I am now legally permitted to build unless I go higher than that, we can or cannot stop that from happening. Or there are probably multiple conditions that come into play.
Yeah, so it depends a little bit on what's being proposed, but we'll talk about SB 9 quickly. So the objective standards, 2-story is objective, that's a height limit. So that's an objective standard. You can continue to apply that under the Housing Accountability Act, SB 9, and the rest. SB 9 says you might have to waive an objective standard if waiving it is required in order for them to put 2 units in at the minimum of 800 square feet. So if given that particular lot size and configuration, and you looked at the setbacks and you looked at what coverage was there, if literally the only way to do it would be to go up, then yes, SB 9 says you have to. But if you think about the average lot sizes here in the residential zones, which, and Christy can step in if I'm misquoting here, which I think are 5,000, and you think about splitting those and the 2 lots that can go in with a minimum of 800, the likelihood of having to go up and violate that objective standard is exceedingly low, and I'm not sure there's any lot in town where that would have to happen.
Got it. Thank you. Councilmember Mueller?
Yes, I just have a kind of a broad stroke question. So we will be as part, well, the 2x2 will primarily be working on policies related to these 2 new documents and updating other policies that we currently have in our housing element. Is that, and then we'll also be having a lot of meetings with the public and a lot of discussion about this. Is that how this is all going to translate? And we're not just going to go back and do our Zoto again. This really, well, or do they have to get incorporated in that? Because I know a lot of these policies, they have to go in the housing elements. Can you walk us through that process?
Yeah, and I'm actually going to hand it over to the new planning director, Kirsty, who can give you a more detailed answer on that process.
Okay,
yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gary. And first of all, I just want to say thanks to Gary for a really comprehensive housing overview. As Mayor mentioned, it's been a big topic. There's been a lot of conversation about it. I also want to take the opportunity to say thank you to the ZDRB members who joined us. We're going to be talking a lot about housing over the next forthcoming months. And I just want to assure everybody that the good news here in Yountville is it's a case, it's going to be, we don't know how much it's going to affect Yountville. For the most part, some of these, if a homeowner wants to ask for some of these SB 9 privileges, it's really going to be a case-by-case basis. The good news is the Yountville Planning Department and the Engineering Department, we really have an open door policy. We encourage folks to come in and talk to start with. So what does it mean for Yountville? We really don't know, and it's going to be something that as we get more detail, we're going to start to refine. So I think Gary did a good job of really understanding the objective standards. The good news is all the effort that everybody just did on the consolidation of that zoning and design ordinance has a laundry list of these objective standards. You might be seeing some more come through as we start to really work with these, with combining these new state laws and working with the new Zoto and working with local property owners. You might start to see us coming to the council and ask for some changes. And majorly what staff's going to be doing, I'm here with Public Works Director John, and as these applications come in, if we start to see them, this 30-day review is going to be really comprehensive. It's going to be a laundry list understanding of if they're compliant with objective standards. This back and forth with the applicant, we already do. It's probably going to be a little bit more refined, more involved as a spreadsheet, yes or no, rather than, well, we'd like the door here. It's going to say yes or no. And ZDRB, it's helpful that you guys are here because some of the staff report is going to look different. The conversation is going to be different. Staff recommendation is going to be a little bit different. It's going to be more of a, does it tick the box, yes or no? Once a project comes to you, it's going to have this back and forth already refined. We're going to let you know, is this part of the Housing Accountability Act? Does the Housing Accountability Act play into effect? The objective standards are going to be really clear. So the good news is the projects are still going to come to the ZDRB unless it's a new ADU. You're going to see these projects, you're going to know of them, staff's going to keep you up to date. And we're really going to be, trying to work with everybody as much as we can. In the event something comes up, I think you guys are going to be the first to know if it looks like. I think Gary did a really good job of, Steve and I, we can probably count the number of lots that this might apply to. That's one of the benefit of Yountville. And we really think that Yountville is, in a different situation because it's really going to be market-driven development. What the projects that we're seeing here, even the inclusion of if you look at the most recent accessory dwelling units that have been processed through Yountville, it's really an extension of the living area rather than more housing for rent. Obviously, with the housing element and with having our commitment to affordable housing, we're going to continue to encourage infill housing. But one thing that the new state law does mandate does provide us the ability to require a 3-year owner occupancy. The town's really going to take that seriously. We are going to enforce that. We're going to make sure that the applicant understands that these requirements will be enforced. So we are going to be doing everything we can just to continue thoughtful, good design, continue to work really well with the applicants that come forward, continue the ZDRB's role of providing influence and just a clear understanding of what's these objective standards versus, I agree with Councilmember Moeller. We're going to be talking a lot about this in these public meetings about housing. Can we take into consideration SB9 as part of our RHNA numbers? There's a little bit assumed development with SB9, and then the RHNA numbers that we have to come forward with, we are going to have to show that we have the zoning and the ability to do so. I don't know if we're going to be able to prove that Yountville is going to have all of a sudden all this infill rental housing on an existing single family home for redevelopment. So I think the intention of this is to kind of kick off all things housing over the next 4 or 5 months. We're going to be having a lot of these conversations. We really wanted Town Attorney Gary to set the stage, have everybody understand what we're being faced with, what we're responding to. This just happened this fall, so we're doing it quite expeditiously. If you see changes to the objective standards, you guys are going to understand the background behind it. ZDRB for your next meeting, if your staff report looks different and there's a different understanding, you're going to understand why. And yeah, we really want this to be a question and answer. I just wanted to kind of put it into perspective of what you can expect in Yountville versus another city that might have more infill opportunity.
Kirsty, thank you very much.
Introduce Diane Levine, our assistant planner. I don't know if everyone's seen her, but we also wanted to take the opportunity to let you know that she's here as well.
Yes, thank you both for being a part of this. Also to recognize Hillary Tripp, Stephen Miller, and Kimberly Cook from our ZDRB that are participating in this as well. And with that, I'll invite Kimberly Cook, who has her hand raised. Kim.
Hi, thank you, Mayor Dunbar, and thank you, Gary, for that presentation. It would be kind of handy to have that printed and in hand since it just hit the highlights. And nice to meet you, Kirsty. Meet you, sort of. Just one kind of question, since there is that initiative that is already out for title and summary for the November ballot that would reverse all this. And this is set to take effect January 1. Is there any sort of hold or pause or I don't know the legal terms on SB 9 until then?
I don't believe so. So when a state law is referended, it does pause it, but that's a specific action different than an initiative. So a referendum is to put before the voters a law that has already been passed. I don't believe SB 9 has been referended.
And Gary, does SB 9 come into effect January 1? When does it actually? Yeah.
Yes, January 1, to be clear, yes. And so separately, there's an initiative, and that's the one I mentioned at the end of the presentation. The initiative sweeps more broadly than SB 9. It's not just related to SB 9. It talks about all local land use decisions, and it's much broader than that. So it will not affect the implementation date of January 1.
But if somebody did file a reprimand? What did you call it?
A
That would-
referendum.
Referendum?
Yeah, they have a certain amount of time under state law to gather signatures, and they have to gather quite a lot of them in order to do it. But yes, if somebody filed a referendum and gathered enough signatures, it would pause the law until the voters vote on it.
And when would something like that possibly happen? What's the deadline?
So state law on referendums, I would have to confirm the deadline with you outside of this meeting. They have a few months to do it, certainly. And it's a lot of signatures. It's a percentage of the number of people who voted statewide in the last governor's election, which I think it's 5% of that or like. So it's a lot of signatures they need to gather.
Okay, there's just a lot of pushback on this, so I wondered. Okay, thank you very much.
And Gary, would the initiative and or referendum apply only to the general election in November as opposed to the primary in June?
I think it is now in November. I think the legislature's consolidated all of these to encourage turnout and to have more voter participation. I think they are all now in the November election. The legislature can move that and sometimes does, and some hesitant to say that. So when these things appear in elections, and the dates is a legislative decision ultimately that's set by statute and sometimes changed. So.
And to follow up on Kimberly's question, do the city's lawsuits about the applications of SB 9 have any impact on timing or execution of the January 1 start date?
Not that I'm aware of. I'm not aware right now of an injunction or any other court order that would stop that implementation date. That's certainly something we're tracking, and if a referendum or anything else changed, we'd certainly let the town know, but I'm not aware of anything that would delay January 1.
Yeah, there's plenty of activity, that's for sure.
Yes.
Yeah, Councilmember Knight.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Town Attorney Bell, for very complex report. And I appreciate that. And I look forward to reviewing more of the documents. Just a quick question in terms of the impact on Yountville. We've approved ADUs, in the past few years. It doesn't necessarily create a rental unit. And so is there a significant difference with SB 9 and a lot split where I understand there's a requirement that that one of the lots or the lots be owner occupied, but does it guarantee that that other second unit becomes a viable second or rental unit for someone unrelated to the lot split applicant?
It does not require that. I think it could be rented or sold off separately.
But so it could be sold, but in terms of it doesn't become an option for a second unit that's that it just becomes an extension of the home in terms of a design. Is there a requirement that it be sold or rented, legally rented, or do they have a?
Not that I'm aware of. I think the way that SB 9 reads, it's the creation of the housing units.
And if I could, Councilmember Knight, from a practical standpoint, what you described is where ADUs are constructed. We're already experiencing that in Yountville. A number of them have been approved under the ADU streamlining bill, and they are simply an extension of the living unit. And they have not been put into the rental market in terms of addressing additional housing supply.
It's unfortunate. If SB 9 doesn't create an opportunity really to create housing, then it has a questionable value.
Right.
Thank you for the information.
What I would say, Councilmember Knight, is one of the concerns that a lot of people on both sides of SB 9 have was exactly that. A lot of housing advocates were concerned that the language in there was not strong enough on actually resulting in increased housing and affordable housing. So that generated some concerns with that. So it will be interesting to see, as has been noted, this is just the beginning of this conversation, and there will be a number of things that we will continue to monitor and look at. But yes, it's not necessarily in all communities has it resulted in increased housing stock.
Thank you.
And to say it's generated some concerns, I would say it's a very bold understatement, but yes, there's significant discussion about the lack of creation of affordable units. There's no requirement of that. And that was one of the big issues with folks opposing SB 9. It was purely about trying to get numbers, even if it wasn't satisfying the most critical needs of the types of affordability of housing. So, and every jurisdiction has a different opinion about whether they embrace this or not. So I don't see any other hands raised. I do also want to say thank you, Gary, very much, and also Kirsty for adding to Gary's information. It's not only complicated, but it's very much in flux. And every time there's a legislative session, something may change. And so we are staying very, focused on it. And we have a history, a very good history of being proactive and getting in front of some of these things. I think the ADUs is one example, and you've certainly heard me and a few others that are active in Cal Cities talking about SB 9 for at least a couple of years. We talked about SB 50 for a couple of years, and there were a lot of elements there that showed up in SB 8, 9, and 10 that did get passed. So a lot more housing discussion going forward. I do believe that is all of our discussion for today on housing. Again, Gary, thank you very much. We will have the presentation available to the public as well as all those that are on the call today, so that you can put it on your refrigerator and have it visible at all times. I'd say attach it to your composting bucket, but the buckets are too small. The font size would be very hard to read. But again, thank you very much for the information and going forward. Thank you to our ZDRB members that are here, so that you will understand, as Kirsty said, how and why certain things are looking different and coming to you, especially in 2022, as we kind of absorb all the new changes. So with that, I think that takes care of our business for today's council meeting. We will be adjourning to our next regular meeting, which is Tuesday, December 7th at 3 p.m. Don't forget, Santa is on his way this Sunday. Please come join us at the Yountville Community Center to kick off our holidays in Yountville and spread some holiday cheer and just celebrate it as a community. And looking forward to seeing you all out there. So with that, we will go ahead and adjourn to December 7th. Thank you, everyone.
Good night, all. Thank you. Bye.
Good night.
Good night.